class. Today we are going to be making some hearts inspired by the artist Romero Britto. Notice in his art, he uses a lot of thick, bold black lines to separate his artwork into different chunks so that he can put different patterns and different colors in each piece to combine them all to almost look like a quilt-like picture. In order to make our dark, thick, bold black lines today, we are going to be using some India ink in a bingo dauber. I will show you how to use these in just a minute. This is kind of what it looks like. We will be using that for our big black lines. And then if you notice the small lines, the thinner lines that I have in here, they are done with Sharpie after I did my big, bold, thick lines with the Indian ink. So the first thing you're going to want to do is put your name on the back of your paperwork, which I've already done. I'm going to flip over my square. And then what I would do is I would plan out my picture ahead of time instead of just going straight to the ink. So what I would do is I would take a pencil and I would go ahead and plan out and draw my heart very lightly. That way it doesn't take away from your picture if you have some heart, like some pencil lines and stuff left on your heart. Then I would plan out where you want some of these random bold black lines to be. So I might come across my artwork maybe down across this way and break it up this way. Put some in the background. You can kind of curve some of the lines if you want to. But these are going to be my big bold black lines. Maybe a couple more here, and maybe one across this way. Those are going to be the ones that I make nice, big, and bold. To use the India ink, what you want to do, the Indian ink, you go ahead and twist off the top of the dauber. Now when you do this, you want to push down. There is like a little button inside there. You can almost feel it when you push down on it. And you don't really necessarily want to squeeze the ink out because then it will just pour out all over your picture and make a mess. So you want to push down, maybe squeeze slightly. I wouldn't really squeeze at all unless none of the ink is coming out. And I would go and trace my lines with this ink. So I'm going to go ahead and push down. I can kind of feel that that piece, that little button inside went up. And I'm going to start drawing. Now, when you do the Indian ink like this in paint daubers, it's not always going to be perfect. You might get a little bit of smudging too. And that's okay. Just do the best you can. Just try your best not to squeeze it so that it doesn't bleed out all over your paper. Now the Indian ink dries pretty quickly, so it shouldn't be too long after I get my ink on here that I can go ahead and start working on the rest of my picture. While I'm waiting for some of the Indian ink to dry, I could do some polka dots, or like right here with my Indian ink, I drew some larger polka dots, and then later after it was dry, I colored them in. Over here, I just daubed some polka dots down with the ink, just to make some nice dark black polka dots. You could do something like that while you're waiting. Now I notice on this picture, my Indian ink is going to take a little bit longer to dry than my last picture because it looks like it's a little bit thicker on there. It's hard to tell from the screen. But what I can do is I can go ahead and start adding some of my smaller Sharpie lines inside of my heart. While it's drying, I just want to try to keep the Sharpie from getting inside that India ink. Let's see, I could even do some circles here. Oops, see how a little bit spilled out there? I probably accidentally squeezed it a little bit, and that does happen. So I'm going to stop there with my Indian ink, and I'm going to go ahead and add some patterns, some nice thin lines with my Sharpie. Again, trying not to get it in the wet Indian ink because I don't want to really ruin my Sharpies. So down here, maybe I want to add some nice flower patterns. And when we go to color these in, you can use crayons, you can use markers, you could use watercolors. My rule is, though, that if you're going to use watercolors, I would use the markers or the crayons that you're going to use first and save the watercolor for last. Now, the watercolor will show up over marker. So right here on this part of my paper, I did yellow marker and then I did some black watercolor. The marker doesn't have the wax in it that the crayon does. So it's going to go ahead and absorb it, and it's going to paint right on top of it. Anywhere that you color with crayon is not going to soak up that watercolor ink, and so it'll stay the color that you colored it with crayon. So you have to be really careful. If you color something with marker and then you go back over it with watercolor, it will cover up your marker. It won't cover up your crayon though. So I'm going to go ahead and keep working on my patterns here. So maybe I have some flower patterns. Maybe I would like some skinny stripes. Now I'm going to try not to get it in my wet ink, so my stripe might not go all the way to that big thick line, and that's okay because I really, 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 really want to avoid the wet spots. So I'm going to add a few lines going this way. I could even add, let's say, some checker patterns. So I'm going to do some horizontal lines. And see, notice I'm trying to avoid anywhere where it's wet. Here is dry, but some of the areas where I have more ink than the rest of it is still wet. And I want to try to keep my fingers out of that ink so that I don't smear that Indian ink all over my picture. So when I go to touch my paper, I try to touch it just where the dry areas are to hold it still. So I'm going to go ahead and add my checkerboard pattern here. And since we are making a heart, I could even do a nice little heart pattern in one of my sections. It's kind of up to you what kind of patterns you want to do. Some of these I might color in marker and then do some watercolor over the top. Some of these I might just add straight crayon patterns like polka dots and things like that. It kind of depends on you and what you want your artwork to look like. But right now, I think that's enough with the black. I've got some black thin lines. I've got the nice thick lines broken up. I've got different patterns in each section. Oh, you know what? I'm missing my favorite pattern, and I think I want to add that on there. I'm going to go ahead and add some nice spirals. And I think that later, when I go to use watercolor, because I'm using watercolor last out of all my materials, I can color that in with my watercolor. So now that I have my picture ready, it's still a little bit wet, but in the areas where it's dry, I can go ahead and at least start coloring my picture. I know I'm not going to get done today, but I can at least get a little bit done while I'm waiting if I have time. So I noticed that down here my flowers are just in Sharpie. They're nice and dry. I just need to avoid this area. I can use some crayons, and then later, like next week, I can go back and paint that in with watercolor. This area I might want to avoid, especially with this one dot that's really, really wet. I think I'm going to leave it that way for now till it dries off. Up in some of these areas, if I want to spin my picture around to where it's dry down here, I could go ahead and start adding some more patterns on my picture. I could probably start coloring in these checkerboards, but just get really, really cautious when I get close to where it's wet on that Indian ink. I can try to color in some of these stripes. I can color in the hearts. I can take some markers and maybe color one section like with just marker, and then later I can go back and I can use watercolor paints to maybe make some small polka dots or some like black stripes with my watercolor paint. It's, like I said, it's kind of up to you and what you want your picture to look like. If you get to the point where everything is just so wet everywhere that you don't really have anything else you can color, you can go ahead and put it up to dry on the drying board, and we'll finish coloring it and painting it next week. When you go to pick it up, I would pick it up with two hands and hold it flat. because any of that Indian ink that has a little pool, like right here on my circle, if I let my paper kind of fall down like this, I hold it with one hand, and it's going to start dripping down and make a big, huge mudslide right on my paper. So you want to hold it with two hands carefully and go put it up to dry, and we will finish coloring these and painting these next time we have class.